4 engines didn't ignite, a decision-making system faster than any human could react. That's the why part of the title. But that's only half the story. Because right after the system did exactly what it was supposed to do, another problem appeared. Even if the fix had taken just 5 minutes, Flight 13 still couldn't have launched again that day. 2 questions, 1 single answer. And that answer is what truly reveals why this was never a failure, right after this. 4 engines, on the same side, on the same middle ring of the cluster of 33. Let's go back through the exact sequence that unfolded that day. The spark suppression system activated first to prevent any unwanted ignition beneath the launch pad. Right after that, the deluge water at the flame trench and atop the pad began spraying, following the standard sequence used in every Starship launch. Then, according to the telemetry data shown on the live stream, 29 of Booster 20's 33 Raptor engines lit up one after another. And the moment that number stopped at 29, instead of reaching 33, the flight computer had to make a decision no human could react to by hand in time. Continue and accept the risk of an off-center liftoff with an enormous amount of thrust. Or abort immediately while all the hold-down clamps were still in place on the pad. It chose to abort. This is the core answer to the why in the title, and it has a specific source. According to the telemetry data broadcast live during the launch, combined with the technical criteria SpaceX had already established for Starship, the vehicle is allowed to tolerate up to 3 engine failures during startup. The 4th engine crossed that threshold, and the entire system immediately cut off, following a pre-programmed sequence, not some random panicked reaction. That's the first half of the story. But here's the part that makes even the most dedicated Starship watchers pause for a moment. Suppose SpaceX had fixed these 4 engines in exactly 5 minutes right afterward. Could they have flown that same day? The answer is no. And the reason why is the most valuable part of this entire story. Imagine you're standing in line at a store about to close. The staff have already started mopping the floor with water. From that moment on, no matter how fast you pay, the store still has to close on time, because the cleanup process has already been triggered and there's no going back. That's almost exactly what happened with Flight 13, say. According to observations from the Starbase tracking team at NASA Spaceflight, once the deluge fire suppression system activates, the massive water flow sprayed onto the pad to absorb heat and shock the instant the engines ignite. Any stop after that point automatically becomes a complete launch scrub. There's no going back to the countdown. For this attempt, SpaceX also changed how it ran the countdown compared to previous attempts. The final hold checkpoint was moved from the T-40 second mark to the T-60 second mark, as announced by SpaceX during the live broadcast, in order to front-load the final checks earlier and spread the workload more evenly before the critical moment. Normally, SpaceX has about 5 to 8 minutes of hold time before being forced to fully scrub a launch attempt. Notably, on Flight 12, they once held for nearly 10 minutes, showing that this number isn't fixed, but depends on the specific conditions of each countdown, rather than being a hard limit. But on Flight 13, the deluge had already activated before the abort command was issued. And once it activated, even if those 4 engines had suddenly healed themselves within the next 5 minutes, the vehicle still couldn't have lifted off that day. Why is it so absolute? Because to attempt another launch, the entire Starship and Super Heavy stack has to go through a complete propellant offload, then be reloaded from scratch. For a vehicle standing over 400 feet tall, holding thousands of tons of deeply chilled liquid oxygen and liquid methane, that process isn't something done in a hurry. It takes roughly 2 to 4 hours. Meanwhile, the launch window for the Flight 13 mission was a mere 90 minutes. Let's put those 2 numbers side by side again. 4 hours needed, 90 minutes allowed. Even in the best case scenario, where nothing was actually broken, Flight 13 still would have been scrubbed that very day. This isn't a technical failure in the literal sense. This is a mathematical constraint. There simply wasn't enough time, no matter how quickly the engines could have been fixed. And this is exactly why the title of this video isn't exaggerating when it says this was never a failure. That statement isn't just words of comfort. It's an accurate description of what actually happened. A system did exactly what it was designed to do, then ran into an operational limit that simply couldn't be overcome that day. Not for lack of capability, but because the countdown clock didn't allow for it. At this point, the question in the title has been answered. But if you want to be even more certain this isn't just empty reassurance, here are 3 additional layers of evidence below, each one able to stand on its own. Notably, this isn't the first time in SpaceX's history that a rocket has had to abort after its engines had already ignited. The most recent prior instance was on a Falcon 9 during the Starlink Group 10-2 mission in 2024, not on Starship. That means the post-ignition emergency abort logic isn't some brand new feature invented just for this occasion. It's part of the safety culture SpaceX has applied across multiple different rocket lines. It's just that this was the first time it was ever put to the test on Starship itself. The second layer of evidence lies with the engines that actually failed. Of the 10 engines that were damaged in a static fire incident on Booster 19 back in 2024, an incident that forced all 10 engines to be pulled from the lineup for a full repair, 9 returned to fly in healthy condition, installed directly onto Booster 20. This is the same booster that had just set the record for a 33-engine, 25-second static fire, the longest in the program's history, just days before this launch attempt. Only one of those 10 engines, serial number Raptor 78, was among the 4 engines that failed this time. The data shows the failure rate of the refurbished batch of engines, 1 in 10, was actually lower than the average failure rate across the full 33-engine cluster in this event. If that number accurately reflects reality, the cause is more likely not tied to Raptor 78's repair history, but to some other factor, possibly a step in the launch preparation process, possibly an individual component that hasn't been publicly identified. SpaceX hasn't announced an official cause, and a serious analysis channel shouldn't guess wildly when the data isn't sufficient to draw a conclusion. The third layer of evidence lies in the actual damage numbers. Only 2 of the 33 engines needed replacement, not 4, not more. All 29 engines that ignited successfully were inspected and found clean. That shows the engine cutoff command, even though it happened in a split second, didn't let the damage spread beyond the exact group that had originally failed. And that matters for more than just the vehicle itself. The launch pad, the single most expensive and hardest to replace structure in the entire system, also showed no significant damage from this engine cutoff. It might sound like a small detail, but it's exactly why. Just days later, Booster 21 was able to continue its own testing timeline without having to wait for pad repairs first. A clean engine cutoff didn't just save the vehicle. It also kept the pace for everything that happened afterward. There's one more thing worth mentioning here because it directly relates to the credibility of what you're hearing right now. When Booster 20 was lifted off the pad to be brought back to the factory, footage showed what looked like a few missing parts around the engine cluster, along with peeling paint near the quick disconnect joints. Both details went viral on social media, along with speculation that the abort had caused more widespread damage than officially reported. In reality, those missing-looking parts had never actually been installed before the vehicle rolled out to the pad in the first place, and the peeling paint at the quick disconnect joints is a completely normal occurrence that doesn't affect the structure. A serious analysis video should clarify this, rather than letting ambiguity spiral into a completely different story from what actually happened. If this analysis is helping you see this week's event in a completely different light than what most other channels are saying, now is the logical moment to hit subscribe. Because honestly, the next part is even more noteworthy. Because while the whole world was watching one booster sitting still on the pad, the rest of the Starship program didn't stop for even a single day. Based on actual footage from Starbase captured by NASA Spaceflight and RGV aerial photography during the exact week the incident occurred, there are at least 5 other fronts of the program running in parallel, none of which had to stop and wait for Booster 20. The first front raises a question. If Booster 20 succeeds on its next attempt, which booster will be the first to be caught by the chopstick arms, rather than landing in the water? The answer is already being prepared this very week. Booster 21. While Booster 20 rolled back to the factory for inspection, Booster 21 left Mega Bay 1 and headed straight into cryogenic testing at the Massey's test site. This isn't simply a cryogenic propellant loading test. The test stand has hydraulic cylinders that push directly against the aft section of the booster, precisely simulating the force the real Raptor engine cluster would generate during operation. A mandatory step to confirm the aft section can handle the load, before the booster is fitted with real engines and rolled out to the pad for the first time. If Booster 20 successfully lands in the Gulf of Mexico on its next attempt, Booster 21 could well become the first Block 3 booster to be caught by the chopstick arm. And if that happens, SpaceX will face a notable logistics decision. Keep Booster 21 at Starbase to keep flying, or ship it via the barge Marmac 31 to Florida to use a booster with real flight experience for the first launch from the US East Coast. The second front answers a different question. When will Starship leave Texas for the first time? That answer was also just confirmed this very week. At Star Factory, Ship 43 just completed the nose-to-body mating step. The final step for a vehicle to be considered structurally complete. Ship 43 has been designated to fly on Flight 15. And this won't be an ordinary flight. It will be the first Starship launch from Launch Complex 39A in Florida, marking the first time the program officially leaves Texas. The third front is a specific number. Only 2 more modules to go. That's the remaining gap between the program's 4th launch tower and its full height. In Florida, the 4th launch tower, located at Space Launch Complex 37, has nearly reached its maximum height. The construction crew just finished installing the 7th of 9 modules, then almost immediately moved on to installing the 8th. The pace of this tower's construction, according to SpaceX itself, is significantly faster than the 2 launch towers built before it. Notably, SLC-37's tower isn't the only launch pad taking shape in Florida. It's the second pad, after LC-39A, where Ship 43 is expected to lift off on Flight 15. Having 2 pads developing in parallel means that as soon as one runs into an operational issue, such as needing more time for inspections, the other can continue on its own independent timeline, a form of infrastructure risk distribution, though one rarely mentioned in news coverage. The 4th front isn't about speed, but about method. A small change in the construction process that could determine how fast every future launch pad gets built. At Pad 1, prefabricated segments of the service structure have been craned into their final positions. What's notable isn't the installation itself, but the method. At Pad 2 and Launch Complex 39A, the massive A-frame structures are fully assembled first, then moved into place next to the completed flame trench. At Pad 1, SpaceX split the frame into 3 separate sections and installed each one as soon as the flame trench's foundation was solid enough, without waiting for the entire flame trench to be finished. This is, in theory, a faster approach, and if it proves effective, it could significantly shorten construction time for future launch pads. And the final front answers the most direct question of all. While Booster 20 sat still, how many other vehicles kept moving? During the very same week the incident occurred, the production line at the Sanchez site didn't slow down for a single beat. Booster 22 brought its first body segment into Mega Bay 1 to begin assembly. Booster 19 just completed its own static fire test and returned to the factory to prepare for the next step. Ship 42 received another new body segment. In other words, at least 3 other vehicles kept moving through the assembly process, exactly on the schedule that had been set before the incident ever happened. In parallel with that, 2 other testing programs are directly supporting fixes for issues still outstanding from the previous flight, Flight 12. One is grid fin actuator testing, being carried out on a test rig called Booster 18.3, aimed at precisely measuring how much control these fins can provide, after Flight 12 recorded the booster never dropping below the speed of sound throughout its return trip. The other is vertical load testing on the landing propellant tank, directly supporting the plan to fire 13 Raptor 3 engines simultaneously during the final landing phase, a number that appears right on the Flight 13 mission patch itself. This is the channel's own analysis, not something coming from any official SpaceX statement. A program only truly falls into crisis when its entire operation depends on a single point of failure, and that point just broke. But this week's data shows almost the complete opposite. While one booster sat still for technical inspection, 5 other fronts of the same program kept moving exactly on the schedule that had already been set. If you ever thought that a single launch scrub meant the whole program had to grind to a halt along with it, this week's data is evidence to the contrary, concrete and verifiable through actual footage, not some generic reassurance. So what happens next? According to statements from Elon Musk right after the incident, 2 Raptor engines will be replaced before the next attempt. And according to the latest update from SpaceX, the next launch attempt is being targeted for Thursday, July 23rd. If SpaceX identifies the specific cause of the 4 failed engines before that date, and no new issues arise during reinspection, there's a good chance the next attempt will happen right on the new schedule. But if the cause turns out not to be tied to a single component, but instead to a broader factor in the launch preparation process, the July 23rd date could easily be pushed back again. This is a conditional hypothesis, not a firm claim. There's one small detail, one that almost no one is paying attention to, but it's the most worth watching when the next attempt happens. Raptor serial number 78, the only engine among the 10 refurbished engines to fail this time, will it be reinstalled onto Booster 20, or will it be permanently removed from the flight lineup? If it goes back on and performs normally on the next attempt, that will be strong evidence that this failure was just a random incident, unrelated to its repair history. But if it never appears again in Booster 20's flight engine roster, that absence, by itself, will already be an answer. There's another way to look at the same question. Across Booster 20's 2 most recent static fire tests, the record-setting 25-second static fire, and the very countdown that led to the abort. The same cluster of 33 engines produced two completely opposite outcomes, less than a week apart. If the hardware didn't change, yet the results were this different, the real question no longer lies in which engine failed. It lies at a deeper level. What changed between those two countdowns that the naked eye can't see? That's the question SpaceX's own engineering team is still trying to answer, right now, as you're hearing these words. Thank you for digging all the way to the bottom of this with the Space Brief. If you found this analysis helpful, please like, share, leave a comment, and subscribe. A related video is waiting for you right on the end screen.